In 2020, Simon Cowell fell from an electric bike. His spine shattered into multiple fractures. Paramedics said he was lucky to be alive. 2 years later, he fell again. Same accident, same bike. But there's something far more brutal than those accidents. Something the cameras never captured. Because the man who discovered Kelly Clarkson, One Direction, and Susan Boyle, the mogul who built a $600 million empire deciding who deserved fame and who deserved to go home. That man paid a price no fortune can buy back. A childhood starved of affection. A bankruptcy that threw him back into his teenage bedroom. A scandal that shattered friendships. The loss of people he loved, including a young star he considered a son. And a battle with his own reflection that left him unrecognizable, even to himself. Today, at 65, Simon Cowell is no longer the ruthless judge. He moves carefully, protecting a spine held together by steel rods. His tired eyes can barely focus, and he holds his son Eric tighter than most fathers do, terrified that time is running out. How did the invisible boy nobody loved become the most powerful man on television? What happened behind the scenes of American Idol, The X Factor, and Got Talent that nobody saw? Why did he betray a close friend? And how did two near-fatal accidents and Liam Payne's death completely transform who he is? Before we answer, we need to go back in time. To a boy who cried alone in bathrooms, who went bankrupt at 30, and who learned the hard way that no amount of fame, fortune, or power can shield you from life's cruelest truths. Simon Cowell's first stage was not lit by spotlights or filled with applause. It was cold, silent, and empty. Born on October 7, 1959, in Lambeth, London, he entered a world that looked perfect from the outside, but felt hollow on the inside. His family wasn't poor, far from it. They lived in the affluent town of Elstree, Hertfordshire, in a home that gleamed with middle-class respectability. But wealth, young Simon learned early, cannot buy warmth. His mother, Julie Brett, had been a ballet dancer and socialite, a woman who glided through rooms with elegance and poise. She was beautiful, admired, the kind of mother other families envied. But to Simon, she was distant, emotionally unreachable. Love, if it existed, was never spoken. Affection was rationed like a scarce resource. Julie was present in body, but absent in the ways a child needs most. Years later, Simon would say with painful honesty, "My mother loved me, but she never knew how to show it." His father, Eric Selig Philip Cowell, was even more impossible to reach. A stern music industry executive and estate agent, Eric measured life in achievements, not emotions. He believed in discipline, hard work, and results. Praise was not part of his vocabulary. Simon could excel, and Eric would nod. Simon could fail, and Eric would frown. But never, never did the words, "I'm proud of you," pass his lips. "My father never said he was proud of me," Simon confessed decades later, his voice still carrying the ache of that absence, "even when I needed it the most." That silence became a scar Simon would carry into every boardroom, every audition, every sleepless night. The boy who never heard "well done" became the man obsessed with proving his worth to a world that didn't care. School offered no escape. At Radlett Preparatory School and later Dover College, Simon was the problem child. Restless, rebellious, clashing with teachers who saw him as difficult rather than different. He wasn't stupid, he was bored. The system demanded conformity, and Simon, already invisible at home, refused to disappear at school too. He broke rules, skipped classes, and earned a reputation as the boy nobody wanted to deal with. His classmates were remembered. Simon was overlooked. He scraped through with barely passing marks, just a single general certificate of education in English and sociology, and left school with no qualifications, no direction, and a crushing sense of failure. In a family where excellence was the only currency, Simon felt bankrupt. By his late teens, rejection wasn't just familiar, it was expected. He tried odd jobs. He drifted. He watched his peers move forward while he stood still. Every door seemed locked. Every opportunity led nowhere. The boy who had been invisible at home and ignored at school was now invisible to the world. Out of pity more than pride, his father pulled strings and got Simon a job in the mailroom at EMI Music Publishing. It was the bottom of the ladder in an industry built on stardom. Every morning, Simon Cowell, the son of a music executive, carried coffee to producers who didn't know his name. He sorted fan mail for artists whose songs filled stadiums while his own presence dissolved into nothing. "I was invisible in a world obsessed with the spotlight," he later admitted, and you can hear the bitterness still clinging to those words. He tried to escape. Once, humiliated by the monotony and invisibility, he quit EMI and walked out, determined to find something better. But the world outside was even crueler. Doors slammed. Interviews went nowhere. Rent became impossible. Within months, broke and broken, Simon crawled back to the same mailroom he had sworn to leave behind. The humiliation was complete, and in that humiliation, something else took root. Something dark and stubborn. Late at night, after hours of being ignored, Simon would lock himself in the bathroom and cry. Not just tears of failure, but tears of fear. The paralyzing fear that this was it, that his life had already peaked at 22, and everything from here would be a slow, invisible descent into nothing. But those tears didn't destroy him. They hardened him. From neglect, he carved resolve. From rejection, he learned defiance. The boy starved of affection was becoming a man who would force the world to notice, no matter the cost. Simon Cowell's childhood wasn't a fairy tale. It was a crucible. Every withheld "I love you," every unspoken "I'm proud of you," every moment of being unseen became fuel. Fuel for an ambition so fierce it bordered on ruthless. Fuel for a drive that would one day make him the most powerful man in television. But it also left scars. Deep, hidden scars that no amount of success would ever fully heal. The boy who wept in silence would grow into a man who commanded stadiums, yet still felt invisible in the quiet of his own home. The child who craved his father's approval would spend a lifetime chasing validation from strangers, never quite believing it when it came. His childhood didn't make him strong, it made him hungry. And that hunger, born in the cold silence of a home that never said, "I love you," would drive him to heights most people can only dream of. But it would also make him lonelier than anyone could imagine. Humiliated but unbroken, Simon Cowell returned to the mailroom at EMI Music Publishing. The same desk, the same stacks of unopened fan letters, the same producers who walked past him without a second glance. But this time, something had shifted. The tears had dried. The shame had calcified into something harder. Simon wasn't just surviving anymore, he was studying. He watched everything: how records were chosen, how artists were packaged, how fame was manufactured and sold. He learned that the music industry wasn't about talent alone. It was about timing, image, and knowing what the masses wanted before they knew it themselves. The mailroom became his classroom, and every ignored day was a lesson in power. By the early 1980s, Simon had clawed his way up to a junior A&R position. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a foothold. And in 1983, he made the boldest and most reckless move of his life. He left EMI and launched his own label, E&S Music, later rebranded as Fanfare Records, in partnership with his boss, Ellis Rich. For the first time in his life, Simon Cowell felt visible. He wasn't just another face in a corporate machine, he was the boss. Fanfare had early success with novelty pop hits like So Macho by Sinita, which climbed the UK charts and made Simon a name people started to remember. Suddenly, he was hosting parties, shaking hands with industry insiders, and tasting the intoxicating sweetness of being somebody. The money came fast. The lifestyle followed. Expensive dinners, flashy clothes, a growing reputation as a young mogul on the rise. For a man who had spent his entire life invisible, starving for approval, this was everything. He had finally escaped the shadow of his father's silence, but empires built on hype collapse just as quickly as they rise. By the late 1980s, the market shifted. The novelty pop sound that had made Fanfare successful became stale. The hits dried up. Acts that once topped charts now couldn't get radio play. Distribution deals fell through. Revenue evaporated. And Simon, barely 30 years old, watched in horror as the empire he thought he was building crumbled into rubble. By 1989, Fanfare Records was dead. Not struggling, dead. Offices abandoned, contracts worthless. And Simon Cowell was left with nothing but crushing debts and a reputation as a failure. Friends vanished. Phone calls went unanswered. Investors who once smiled and shook his hand now avoided him in hallways. The boy who had been invisible his entire childhood had briefly become visible, and then, in the cruelest twist, became invisible again. The financial collapse was devastating, but the emotional collapse was worse. Simon had no home, no income, no prospects. At 30 years old, he was forced to move back into his parents' house in Hertfordshire, back into the same childhood bedroom where he had once cried himself to sleep, feeling unloved and unseen. Except now, it was worse. Now he wasn't just the disappointment who couldn't make his father proud. He was the failure who had tried and lost everything. The humiliation was suffocating. Every morning, waking up in that room felt like a prison sentence, a reminder that he had aimed for the stars and landed face first in the dirt. That time nearly broke me, Simon later admitted, and those who knew him then say the admission doesn't capture the full weight of his despair. He stopped returning calls. He avoided old colleagues. Some days, he barely left his room. The world had given him a glimpse of success, then ripped it away with brutal efficiency. But here's the thing about Simon Cowell. Rejection had been his teacher since childhood, and every time life knocked him down, something stubborn inside refused to stay there. Slowly, agonizingly, he began to rebuild. He took meetings he didn't want to take. He pitched ideas to people who had written him off. He swallowed his pride and accepted small consulting gigs. Anything to survive. The industry whispered that he was finished, washed up before he ever really began. But Simon had learned something in the wreckage of Fanfare. He had learned that chasing critical respect was a fool's game. Critics didn't buy records, ordinary people did. Soccer moms, teenagers, office workers. If you wanted to succeed, you didn't aim for the tastemakers. You aimed for the masses. It was a lesson born of failure, humiliation, and desperation. But it would become the philosophy that changed everything. The collapse of Fanfare Records didn't end Simon Cowell. It reforged him. The boy who had been invisible, the young man who had tasted success and lost it, was becoming something else entirely. Someone harder, sharper, more dangerous. He didn't know it yet, but the bankruptcy, the shame, the nights spent staring at the ceiling of his childhood bedroom, all of it was preparing him for the comeback of a lifetime. Not just survival, but domination. The music industry had chewed him up and spit him out. But Simon Cowell wasn't done. Not even close. The man who would one day sit behind a desk and decide the fates of millions was still crawling through the wreckage, learning the one lesson that would define his empire. Never, ever give up, even when the world tells you you're finished. The early 1990s were not kind to Simon Cowell. He was a man in his 30s, living in his parents' house, carrying the stain of bankruptcy on his name. The industry didn't forget failures. It whispered about them in boardrooms and laughed about them at parties. Simon wasn't just starting over. He was starting from below zero. But desperation has a way of sharpening focus. And Simon, humiliated and broke, made a decision that would change everything. He stopped chasing respect and started chasing results. In 1989, even before fanfare fully collapsed, Simon had begun working as a consultant for BMG Records. It wasn't glamorous. He wasn't the boss anymore. He was just another employee, grinding through meetings, pitching ideas, and fighting for scraps. But he studied the game differently now. He watched what sold, not what critics praised. He tracked chart positions, radio play, and sales figures with obsessive precision. And he noticed something the tastemakers missed. Ordinary people didn't want experimental art. They wanted catchy hooks, familiar melodies, and stars they could believe in. The gap between what critics celebrated and what the public actually bought was enormous, and Simon decided to live in that gap. Throughout the 1990s, Simon signed acts that made industry insiders roll their eyes. Novelty groups, manufactured pop bands, covers of old songs repackaged for new audiences. Acts like Robson and Jerome, a duo of TV actors who released an album of classic ballads that the music press mocked mercilessly. Yet it sold over 2 million copies and became the best-selling album of 1995 in the UK. Then came Westlife. 5 Irish boys assembled into a squeaky clean boy band that critics dismissed as corporate and soulless. But their debut single went straight to #1. Then their second. Then their third. 14 #1 singles in the UK. Over 55 million records sold worldwide. The critics hated them. The public couldn't get enough. Simon didn't care about the sneers. Every time a journalist called his work cheap or manufactured, he checked the sales figures and smiled. He was making millions while the tastemakers struggled to stay relevant. "I learned the hard way," Simon admitted years later. "You sell records first, earn respect later." But it wasn't just about the money. Every success was proof. Proof that the boy dismissed at school was smarter than the teachers who ignored him. Proof that the son who never heard "I'm proud of you" was worth something after all. Proof that the man who lost everything at 30 could claw his way back. Still, the victories felt hollow. Simon was succeeding, but he was alone. The relentless schedule left no room for relationships. The industry that now needed him still didn't respect him. And late at night, in expensive hotel rooms paid for by hit records, Simon would lie awake haunted by the same fear that had paralyzed him in his parents' house. What if I lose it all again? There were nights I lay awake convinced I would lose everything again, he confessed. The trauma of fanfare never fully healed. Success felt fragile, temporary, like something that could vanish in an instant. But then, in 2001, everything changed. A British television producer named Simon Fuller approached BMG with a radical idea: a talent competition where the public, not industry executives, would decide who became a star. It would be called Pop Idol, and they wanted Simon Cowell as a judge. Simon hesitated. Television was uncharted territory. What if he failed again? What if the public rejected him the way the industry had? But desperation had taught him one critical lesson: fortune favors the bold. So, Simon said yes. And when the cameras turned on, something extraordinary happened. The public didn't want polite judges offering gentle criticism. They wanted honesty. And Simon Cowell, the man who had spent a lifetime being dismissed, ignored, and rejected, delivered honesty with surgical precision. "You sound like a cat being strangled." That was absolutely dreadful. "I've heard better singing in the shower." The press called him cruel. Industry insiders called him a villain. But the ratings were astronomical. Pop Idol became a phenomenon. And Simon Cowell, the man who had been invisible his entire childhood, suddenly became impossible to ignore. The resurrection was complete. The failed entrepreneur from the mailroom had become the most talked-about figure on British television. But this was just the beginning. America was calling. And Simon Cowell was about to become the most powerful man in entertainment. In 2002, Simon Cowell crossed the Atlantic. Pop Idol had been a smash hit in the UK, but Britain was a small market. America was the prize, the largest entertainment economy in the world, where success meant global domination. When American Idol launched on Fox in June 2002, industry insiders were skeptical. A singing competition? On American television? It would never work. They were spectacularly wrong. American Idol didn't just work, it exploded. Within weeks, it was the highest-rated show on American television. By the end of its first season, over 23 million viewers tuned in to watch Kelly Clarkson crowned the winner. Simon Cowell, the British judge with the acid tongue and the raised eyebrow, became a household name overnight. What made Simon so magnetic wasn't his cruelty. It was his honesty in a world drowning in false praise. For years, talent shows had been polite, encouraging, safe. Judges smiled and said, "Good effort," even when contestants were objectively terrible. Simon shattered that facade. "You have no talent whatsoever." That was like having my ears assaulted. If you had been singing like this 2,000 years ago, people would have stoned you. America had never seen anything like it. The press branded him the meanest man on television. Parents wrote outraged letters. Contestants cried. But the audience was obsessed. They didn't tune in despite Simon's harshness. They tuned in because of it. In a culture of participation trophies and empty encouragement, Simon's brutal honesty felt like fresh air. And beneath the insults was something deeper: discernment. Simon didn't just tear people down. He recognized real talent when he saw it. Kelly Clarkson, Carrie Underwood, Jennifer Hudson, Daughtry. These weren't flukes. Simon had spent 2 decades in the music industry learning to spot the difference between someone who could sing and someone who could sell. And when he said yes, it meant something. By the mid-2000s, Simon Cowell wasn't just a television judge, he was a cultural phenomenon. His face was on magazine covers. His quotes became memes. Saturday Night Live parodied him. The Simpsons featured him. He was simultaneously the most loved and most hated man on television, and the controversy only made him more powerful. But Simon wasn't satisfied with American Idol. In 2004, he launched The X Factor in the UK, a show he created and owned, giving him full creative control. Unlike Idol, which only featured solo singers, The X Factor welcomed groups, older contestants, and performers the industry had already rejected. It was American Idol on steroids. The X Factor became an instant hit, launching the careers of Leona Lewis, One Direction, Little Mix, and Fifth Harmony. Simon had perfected the formula: find raw talent, package it with precision, and let the public fall in love. He wasn't just discovering stars, he was manufacturing them with assembly line efficiency. Then came the Got Talent franchise. Launched in 2006 with Britain's Got Talent, the show expanded beyond singers to include dancers, magicians, comedians, dog trainers, anyone with an act. It was a broader net, catching talent that traditional music shows would never touch. Susan Boyle, the Scottish church volunteer who stunned the world with "I Dreamed a Dream," became a global sensation overnight. Her audition video became the most watched YouTube clip of 2009. Got Talent franchises spread like wildfire. America's Got Talent, Asia's Got Talent, Africa's Got Talent, Arab's Got Talent. At its peak, over 70 countries had their own versions. Simon Cowell's formats were airing in over 100 nations, reaching an estimated 600 million viewers globally. He had built a television empire unlike anything the world had ever seen. The money followed. By 2010, Simon's production company, Psycho Entertainment, was generating hundreds of millions in revenue annually. His personal net worth soared past $500 million. He owned mansions in Los Angeles, London, and Barbados. His garage housed a collection of supercars, Bugattis, Ferraris, Rolls-Royces. He dated models and actresses, flew on private jets, and lived the kind of life that once seemed impossible for the invisible boy from the mailroom. But power, Simon was learning, comes with a brutal price. The schedule was relentless. Filming American Idol and The X Factor, and Britain's Got Talent and America's Got Talent, meant months of grueling 18-hour days. Auditions in 5 cities. Live shows every week. Strategy meetings until midnight. The pressure to maintain ratings, to keep the franchises fresh, to stay ahead of competitors, it was suffocating. And the public turned on him. The same audiences who once loved his honesty now called him a bully. Think Pieces accused him of exploiting vulnerable contestants. Activists protested outside studios. He received death threats. Contestants who didn't make it blamed Simon for crushing their dreams, as if he owed them fame. "I knew people hated me," Simon admitted years later, "but I also knew I couldn't pretend to be someone I wasn't." Behind the cameras, the loneliness was crushing. Friends drifted away, unable to compete with his impossible schedule. Romantic relationships crumbled under the weight of his obsession with work. The boy who had been starved of affection as a child had become a man starved of connection as an adult. He confessed in a rare, vulnerable moment, "Even in the middle of filming, surrounded by lights and applause, I often felt completely alone." The cruel irony was devastating. Simon Cowell had spent his entire life fighting to be seen, to matter, to force the world to recognize him. And now, at the height of his power, sitting in front of millions of people every week, he had never felt more invisible. The empire was complete, but the man inside it was crumbling. By 2013, Simon Cowell had everything the world told him mattered: fame, fortune, power. His television empire stretched across continents. His net worth had climbed past $300 million. He was untouchable, or so he thought. Then, in July 2013, the news broke, and Simon's carefully constructed world exploded. Lauren Silverman, the wife of one of Simon's close friends, Real estate mogul Andrew Silverman was pregnant, and Simon Cowell was the father. It wasn't just gossip, it was a nuclear scandal. The tabloids erupted with headlines screaming betrayal. Every detail was dissected, analyzed, and weaponized. Simon, the man who had built a career judging others, suddenly found himself judged by millions. And the verdict was brutal. Andrew Silverman filed for divorce, citing adultery and naming Simon as a co-respondent. Friends who had stood by Simon for years quietly distanced themselves. Industry colleagues whispered in hallways. The man who had always controlled the narrative now found himself trapped in one he couldn't escape. "It was not something I'm proud of," Simon admitted later, his voice stripped of its usual confidence. There were no excuses, no spin, just the heavy weight of regret. For a man who had spent his life in control, this was the most powerless moment he had ever experienced. The media frenzy was relentless. Paparazzi camped outside his homes. Every appearance was scrutinized. Late-night talk shows made him the punchline. The internet, always hungry for blood, tore him apart. The judge had become the judged, and the court of public opinion showed no mercy. But underneath the scandal, something unexpected was happening. Simon was terrified, not of the headlines or the lawsuits or the damage to his reputation. He was terrified of becoming a father. At 54 years old, Simon had spent his entire adult life avoiding commitment. He had dated beautiful women, but never stayed. He had built empires, but never a family. Fatherhood was the one stage he had never prepared for. "I didn't think I wanted children," he confessed to a friend. "I thought I'd be terrible at it." On February 14, 2014, Valentine's Day, Eric Philip Cowell was born in New York City. Named after Simon's father, the man who had never said, "I'm proud of you," the baby arrived into a world still crackling with scandal and judgment. And then Simon held his son for the first time. The cameras captured a smile, but they couldn't capture what that moment silenced. All the noise, the tabloids, the lawsuits, the betrayal, the shame, it all faded. In that hospital room, holding a fragile life that depended entirely on him, Simon Cowell felt something he hadn't felt since childhood: unconditional love. "Everything changed," Simon said later, and those who knew him saw it immediately. The transformation wasn't gradual, it was instant and absolute. The man who once measured life in ratings and revenue suddenly revolved his entire existence around bedtime stories and diaper changes. He canceled meetings to be present for Eric's first words. He rearranged filming schedules around bath time. The boardroom king became a nursery regular, swapping contracts for lullabies and critiques for crawling lessons. "My priorities changed completely," Simon admitted. "My world suddenly wasn't about ratings or contracts. It was about him." Friends were stunned by the shift. Simon, the workaholic who once bragged about 18-hour days, now left sets early to read bedtime stories. Simon, who had avoided commitment for 54 years, now spoke endlessly about Lego towers and favorite cartoons. The sharp edges softened. The harshness gave way to patience. Fatherhood saved him, one close associate said. He was on a dark path, even before the scandal. Eric gave him a reason to stop, to heal, to begin again. But redemption doesn't erase consequences. The scandal had left scars that even fatherhood couldn't heal. Friendships were broken, some permanently. Andrew Silverman, once a close friend, was now estranged. Trust, once shattered, is rarely rebuilt. And Simon carried the guilt like a shadow, present even in the brightest moments with Eric. "I lost friends. I lost trust," Simon admitted, "but I gained something I never knew I needed: It wasn't a triumphant escape from consequence. It was a reckoning, a miracle wrapped in controversy, a gift born from ashes. To the tabloids, the scandal eventually faded, replaced by newer dramas and fresher gossip. But to Simon, it remained a defining chapter. The moment he learned that power couldn't shield him from mistakes, and that the greatest transformation often comes from the deepest failures. Eric didn't erase the scandal, but he gave it meaning. The fire that nearly destroyed Simon became the crucible that forged a different man. Less arrogant, more vulnerable, more human. And for the first time in his life, Simon Cowell understood what his father had never taught him: that the truest measure of a man isn't what he builds, but who he loves. August 8, 2020. Malibu, California. Simon Cowell was testing a new electric bike in the courtyard of his $24 million oceanfront home. It was a Saturday afternoon. The sun was shining. Eric, now 6 years old, was playing nearby. Lauren was inside. It should have been a perfect day. Then, in one single second, everything changed. The bike was powerful, too powerful. Simon wasn't prepared for the torque. He squeezed the throttle, and the machine lurched forward violently. Before he could react, he was airborne. Then he was on the ground. And then there was nothing but screaming pain. His back had shattered. Not cracked, not bruised, shattered. Multiple fractures in his spine. Vertebrae compressed. Nerves severed. The impact was so severe that paramedics later said he was lucky to be alive. One wrong movement during the fall, one slightly different angle, and Simon Cowell would have been paralyzed. Or dead. "I came within a minute of not making it," Simon later said, his voice hollow. And he meant it literally. By the time the ambulance arrived, his body was going into shock. His blood pressure was plummeting. Lauren held Eric back, shielding him from the sight of his father broken and bleeding on the pavement. The surgery took 6 hours. 6 excruciating hours of doctors carefully placing a steel rod into Simon's spine, fusing vertebrae, stabilizing what the fall had destroyed. When he woke up, the pain was beyond anything he had ever imagined. Every breath felt like fire. Every attempt to move sent lightning through his body. The pain was beyond anything I'd ever endured, Simon admitted later. And this was a man who had survived public humiliation, bankruptcy, and scandal. But physical agony is different. It's inescapable, relentless. Every second a reminder of your fragility. For weeks, Simon couldn't walk. He couldn't sit up without assistance. He couldn't lift a glass of water. The man who had commanded stages and boardrooms, who had built a $600 million empire on sheer will, was suddenly helpless. Nurses had to help him to the bathroom. Physical therapists had to teach him how to stand again. Every tiny victory, shifting in bed, taking 3 steps, holding his posture for 10 seconds, felt monumental. But the physical pain wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the fear. Fear that he might never fully recover. Fear that his spine, now held together with metal and prayers, might fail. Fear that one wrong move could leave him paralyzed. And worst of all, the fear that Eric might lose his father. "I thought of Eric, and I knew I had to fight," Simon confessed later, his voice trembling. That wasn't bravado. It was raw terror. The image of his 6-year-old son growing up without a father haunted every painful step of recovery. Eric became his greatest healer. The little boy would sit by his father's bedside, holding his hand, telling him about Lego projects and cartoons. When Simon managed to stand for the first time, Eric cheered like his father had just won an Oscar. Those moments, small, ordinary, impossibly precious, gave Simon a reason to endure the agony. Months passed. Slowly, agonizingly, Simon learned to walk again. First with a walker, then with a cane, then, finally, on his own. But the recovery was never complete. His spine would never be the same. Mornings brought stiffness and pain. Sitting for long periods became impossible. The steel rod in his back was a permanent reminder. You are fragile. And just as Simon was beginning to rebuild his strength, fate struck again. January 2022. Another electric bike, another accident. This time, Simon was riding near his home in Malibu when he lost control and crashed. The injuries were less severe: a broken arm, facial bruising, cuts and scrapes, but the psychological impact was devastating. To be knocked down once was tragedy. To be knocked down twice felt like punishment. The headlines mocked him. Simon Cowell crashes again. Late-night comedians made jokes. Social media erupted with memes. The man who had once been untouchable was now a punchline, a cautionary tale about recklessness and ego. But for Simon, the shame wasn't the worst part. It was the realization that he wasn't invincible. That control, the thing he had spent his entire life clinging to, was an illusion. That no amount of money, power, or fame could protect him from a moment of miscalculation. It changed me in every possible way, Simon admitted later. The accidents became a mirror, forcing him to see what he had become. A man who worked too much, who slept too little, who lived at a relentless pace, convinced that stopping meant failure. The accidents didn't just break his body. They broke his denial. Simon began to slow down. He reduced his television commitments. He spent more time at home with Eric and Lauren. He started physical therapy not to return to his old pace, but to simply move without pain. He stopped chasing the next deal, the next show, the next conquest. For the first time in his life, Simon Cowell stopped running. The world saw a man recovering from injuries. But those closest to him saw something deeper. A man who had finally learned that survival isn't about power. It's about presence. That the moments that matter aren't in boardrooms or on television stages, but in quiet mornings with your son, teaching him to ride a bike safely, holding him close, and being grateful for another day. The accidents scarred him, but they also saved him. Because they taught Simon Cowell the one lesson his childhood, his bankruptcy, and his empire never could. That life is brutally, unbearably fragile. And that the greatest strength isn't in never falling. It's in getting back up, even when your body screams in protest, and choosing to live differently. Simon Cowell had survived bankruptcy, scandal, and 2 near-fatal accidents. But nothing prepared him for the losses that would hollow him out in ways physical pain never could. In July 2015, just as Simon was learning to steady himself in the unfamiliar role of fatherhood, his mother, Julie Brett, died at the age of 89. She had lived a long life, graceful until the end. A former ballet dancer who carried herself with poise even as age slowed her steps. To the world, it seemed a natural passing, the quiet close of a long journey. To Simon, it was devastation. Julie had been the anchor in his stormy childhood, the silent witness to his rebellions, the one figure whose approval he had always longed for, even when it was rarely spoken. When she died, Simon was in the middle of producing The X Factor. Cameras, deadlines, contestants, all of it became irrelevant. He stepped away, canceling commitments and retreating into a grief that stripped him of the armor he had worn for decades. "Losing my mom was the hardest thing I've ever gone through," Simon said softly. The silence after her passing was unbearable, but the ache was sharpened by an older wound that had never truly healed. In 1999, long before global fame, Simon had buried his father, Eric Selig Philip Cowell. The stern, distant man who had never said, "I'm proud of you," died before he could see his son rise from bankruptcy to become a household name. Simon carried that regret for years, the knowledge that the one man whose approval he had chased the hardest never got to witness the success that need had created. Now, with his mother gone too, Simon felt as though the last thread tying him to his roots had been severed. The boy who had been invisible was now an orphan, and the silence in his life grew louder. Friends recalled how fragile he looked in those months, the unshakable mogul reduced to silence. But Julie's passing forced something else to surface: reflection. Simon began speaking more about family, about being present, about cherishing moments that fame so often steals. Those who worked with him noticed a new patience, a softness that had rarely surfaced before. And then, just as the wound began to heal, tragedy struck again. This time with a cruelty that defied comprehension. September 2024. Buenos Aires, Argentina. Liam Payne, just 31 years old, fell from a hotel balcony and died. The news hit Simon like a freight train. Liam wasn't just another contestant. He wasn't another name in a catalog of stars Simon had discovered. He was family. The boy Simon had first met at 16, standing nervously under stage lights, carrying a voice filled with unshakable promise. The kid Simon had placed in One Direction, the band he had carefully assembled in 2010, a group that became a global phenomenon and defined an entire generation. Simon remembered that audition, the nervous laugh, the flicker of determination in Liam's eyes. A single yes had unlocked a journey that seemed destined to last decades. To see that light extinguished so abruptly, Simon would later say it was like losing a son. Too young, too soon, too cruel, Simon whispered to a close friend. And that, more than anything, was the truth of it. The world mourned in chorus. Cities glowed with candlelight vigils. Fans flooded social media with lyrics, photos, and broken words of disbelief. But Simon's mourning was solitary. Projects were halted. Cameras switched off. The man who once dominated global primetime chose silence. His nights were no longer filled with bright studios, but with quiet hours alongside Eric. Friends noticed how he held his son tighter, as if every laugh, every bedtime story carried the weight of something sacred. It was as if he was trying to give Eric every moment Liam would never get to give, one recalled. In private, Simon returned to the beginning. He replayed grainy audition tapes of Liam and the boys, so young, so full of untamed hope. What once felt like nostalgia became ritual mourning. Each laugh on tape was a wound, each song a ghost of what might have been. For the man who built careers and engineered culture, the helplessness was unbearable. He could design empires, he could create stars, but he couldn't rewrite this ending. Liam's death didn't just grieve Simon. It scarred him. It became the mirror he could not avoid, showing him the cost of fame, the brevity of life, and the truth that even the brightest lights can be extinguished without warning. And in the cruel emptiness, Simon clung harder to what remained, to Eric, to the rare silences, to the simple and irreplaceable fact of being alive. By the time Simon Cowell entered his 60s, he had endured a catalog of scars, emotional, physical, and professional. But nothing prepared him for the cruelest wound of all, the one he inflicted on himself. For years, Simon had dabbled in cosmetic enhancements. Botox here, fillers there, each procedure justified as maintenance. a shield against the slow march of age. In an industry obsessed with youth, where cameras capture every wrinkle and tabloids dissect every flaw, Simon felt the pressure like a vice tightening around his neck. At first, the changes were subtle, barely noticeable. A smoothed forehead, slightly fuller cheeks. Simon looked refreshed, polished, exactly what television demanded. But as the years accumulated and the interventions multiplied, something shifted. By 2021, fans and critics alike stared in shock at a man who no longer looked like himself. His once expressive features seemed stiff, frozen. His trademark smirk appeared forced. His cheeks were oddly swollen, his face stretched and artificial. Headlines screamed, "Simon Cowell, what happened to his face?" Memes spread mercilessly. Online forums dissected every frame, every angle, every public appearance. For Simon, the irony was brutal. He had built an empire on judging appearances, on telling people they weren't good enough, polished enough, marketable enough. And now he was the one being judged, mocked, ridiculed. "I went too far," Simon admitted in a later interview, his voice stripped of bravado. "There was a point I looked in the mirror and literally didn't recognize myself." That confession carried more weight than the tabloids realized. It wasn't just a cosmetic admission, it was existential. For a man who had clawed his way from invisibility to omnipresence, losing recognition in his own mirror was its own kind of annihilation. The emotional toll ran deeper than vanity. Simon began withdrawing from the spotlight. He reduced his appearances on America's Got Talent. He skipped promotional tours. He let others take the front seat in shows he once dominated. Insiders whispered that he looked tired, diminished, hollowed out. For the first time, Simon understood in his bones what it meant to be the object, not the observer. The judge had become the judged, and the verdict was merciless. But from that humiliation came clarity. Simon made a decision that shocked his inner circle. He would stop. No more Botox. No more fillers. No more chasing an artificial version of youth that made him a stranger to himself. Enough, he decided. Let it age. Let it show. It was more than an aesthetic decision. It was a declaration of peace with himself. He no longer needed to present invincibility. He needed to embrace vulnerability. When Simon eventually re-emerged, it wasn't with the gloss of artificial youth, but with the authenticity of a man who had survived public ridicule and chosen honesty over illusion. His face showed lines, his hair grayed, his frame thinned from discipline rather than vanity. Fans who once mocked him now saw something different: humanity. "I've stopped chasing youth," Simon confessed. "I'd rather chase memories with Eric." The lesson was etched not in contracts or ratings, but in the lines of his face. And for once, he was willing to let them stay. In 2025, Simon Cowell stands at 65 years old, no longer the ruthless figure who once ruled Saturday night television, but a man utterly reshaped by survival, scars, and sober reflection. He still sits on the Got Talent panel, but the role has changed. His verdicts have softened into counsel. His wit has given way to warmth. The man once feared for his sharp tongue now speaks with the patience of someone who knows exactly how fragile life can be. Every word carries the echo of nights spent in pain. Every smile, the shadow of trials endured. At home in his $24 million Beverly Hills mansion, health comes first. Mornings begin with slow, careful Pilates routines prescribed by physical therapists to protect the spine that fractured in 2020. Every careless movement risks reigniting agony. The steel rod in his back is a permanent companion. a cold reminder that his body will never be what it was. Meals are no longer indulgent feasts, but the product of meticulous planning with doctors. Low sodium to fight hypertension. High fiber to ward off digestive issues. Antioxidants to keep fatigue at bay. Every bite feels like a choice between healing or hurting, a friend recalls him saying, but his greatest physical trial is his vision. Decades under harsh stage lights and the lingering effects of trauma have dimmed his eyesight. Reading glasses are constant companions. Dim lighting leaves him squinting. For the man who built an empire on spotting hidden brilliance in young singers, the blurring of vision feels like betrayal. He confides to close friends that the thought of one day being unable to see Eric's face clearly terrifies him more than any headline ever could. These physical struggles bleed into sleepless nights. Pain surging through his back like an old enemy. Anxiety lingering. The fear of falling again. The dread of becoming dependent. The fear that time is running out faster than he can keep up. But every evening, all of this softens in the presence of Eric. Bike rides along Malibu's coast, cautious now, helmets mandatory, fumbling piano keys together, bedtime stories read with effort, but overflowing with love. These moments have become the strongest medicine. Each laugh from his son feels like a promise. Each page turned like a defiance of time itself. Behind these domestic rituals, his empire still hums. Franchises like Got Talent and The X Factor continue generating enormous revenue, sustaining a fortune now estimated at over $600 million. His portfolio is vast. The $24 million Malibu oceanfront mansion, a $45 million Holland Park estate in London. Properties scattered across continents. In his garage sit more than 20 supercars, Ferraris, Rolls-Royces, Aston Martins, a Bugatti Veyron. But most now gather dust. A private jet, once a constant shuttle between continents, flies rarely. They are symbols of a man who once raced against time, but has finally slowed down. And Simon speaks of these riches with detachment, almost disdain. He has already drafted his will. Eric will not inherit the empire. Instead, the money will flow into foundations for children's health care, creative education, and scholarships for disadvantaged youth. I don't want Eric to inherit money, Simon has said. I want him to inherit values, and I want children who begin with nothing to inherit the chances I never had. In this, he is not simply distributing wealth, he is rewriting the meaning of legacy. Even his appearance tells the story of surrender. The era of Botox and speculation is gone. His face is lined, his hair streaked with gray, his frame slimmer from discipline rather than vanity. I've stopped chasing youth, he confessed recently. I'd rather chase memories with Eric. Once mocked for cosmetic excess, he now wears his age with dignity. Each wrinkle a mark of survival. Each gray hair a badge of endurance. Still, beneath the calm lies relentless struggle. The throb of his back when he sits too long. The blurred vision that worsens at night. The constant regimen of medications to stabilize pressure and pain. But instead of hiding, he embraces it. Turning fragility into gratitude, turning survival into purpose. Simon Cowell's story is not one of flawless triumph. It is a story of falling, rising, breaking, and healing. From the invisible boy in the mailroom to the most powerful man in television. From bankruptcy to a $600 million empire. From scandal to fatherhood. From near death to rebirth, he discovered Kelly Clarkson, Carrie Underwood, One Direction, and Susan Boyle. He gave millions of people their moment in the spotlight. But the greatest discovery Simon Cowell ever made wasn't a star. It was himself. The man beneath the empire, the father beneath the mogul, the human beneath the legend. Today, Simon's legacy is no longer measured in ratings or revenue. It's measured in the bedtime stories he reads to Eric, in the scholarships he funds for children who feel invisible, in the grace he shows to contestants who once would have received only harshness. Perhaps the truest lesson of Simon Cowell's life is this: that power fades, fame withers, and health falters. But love, humility, and purpose endure. What will you take from his journey? To slow down before fate forces you to? To cherish laughter above applause? To invest not in possessions, but in presence? Share your reflections below. Subscribe for more untold stories. And remember, the greatest legacy is not empire, it is empathy. Because in every scar, in every shadow, Simon Cowell shows us the ultimate truth: that the measure of a life is not in what you build, but in who you become.